Hello and welcome, my name's Chris, and this is going to be a short video series on how to take your camera and change your pictures from being good to being great. You know, one of the things a lot of us like to do when we get a camera is we like to flip it to auto, and in this series what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to take your camera out of auto and put it in full manual. That's right. So join me on this series if you will, and let's take your good pictures and let's make them great together. In this week's episode, we're going to talk about ISO. Now, what is ISO? Now, ISO is basically the sensitivity. Well, you have to understand, first of all, ISO is a standard, International Standards Organization, and they have set up a standard for sensitivity of, well, used to be applied to film, but now applied to your image sensor inside your camera. So what is ISO? If you think about in week one where we talked about your shutter speed, we talked about if I went out as a redhead out into the outside world and exposed myself to 4 hours of sun, I am going to be more likely to burn than somebody who's darker complected. You know, I may spend a half hour in the sun where that person could spend 4 hours of sun and we have the same kind of sunburn. That's because I'm more sensitive, if you will, to being burned by the sun. Now, that's the way you have to think about ISO. And ISO is a pretty easy thing to understand. In most cameras, there is a way to set your ISO manually, and you have to take that off of auto. And in some cameras, you'll have to go into the menus and take your ISO off of auto. Even if you have your camera in manual, some cameras will still have an auto ISO setting. So that's something to watch out for. But if you go in and adjust your ISO, it depends on the camera as far as how low and how high it'll go. This particular camera, this is the Nikon D7000, it goes up to an ISO 6400, which is rather high for most consumer cameras. You might have something in the ISO 3200 or 2000, depending on the camera and the age of your camera. And what I'm telling the camera there is the higher I put that, the more sensitive to light the image sensor is going to be. So a camera, you know, if you go back and look at our week one video on the shutter speed, if I take a picture and expose it for 1/100th of a second, I can set that as my standard and I can alter my ISO. I can raise my ISO or lower my ISO to make the image sensor more sensitive to light. Now, as we talked about with other things in the world, there are trade-offs to making that camera more sensitive. You may think, well, I'll just put the thing on the max ISO and then adjust everything else around it. Well, here's the problem with that. That is a digital image sensor inside your camera. And your digital image sensor has all these little points that are sensitive to light. And those little points, and depending on the camera, there can be millions of those little photosensitive points on your image sensor. Now, they're electronic. So when they receive light, they kind of figure out what color it's supposed to be and all these different things, and they convert that into an electrical impulse. Now, if you get millions of those guys sitting next to each other, and they're all giving off their little electrical impulses, they're converting light energy to electrical energy. Sometimes what can happen, and what happens all the time when you raise your ISO, is they're so close to each other in there that they start cross-talking with each other. And this guy's electrical impulse goes over and, you know, kind of interferes with this guy's electrical impulse. And this guy's, you know, if you've got a grid of these things and millions of them next to each other, all interfering with each other, and you end up with what's called noise in your image. And if you've seen an image that has noise, you know exactly what it's talking about. Back in the film days is what we would refer to as grain. You know, we would see the grain in the image. But on the digital cameras, we get that as a result of noise that's produced inside that image sensor. So other than the thinking of, well, I'll just max this thing out all the way, the idea is to see how low your ISO can go in a given situation. If you're in a room or if you're in somewhere inside, you're going to have less ambient light. You might have to increase your ISO a little bit. But if you go outside, if you're out where it's very bright, you want to just decrease that thing as much as you can. And in all circumstances, always try to go with the lowest ISO that will work with your exposure time and your aperture setting that you have involved. So there's some things to think about with ISO, and this kind of rounds out the big three as far as your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO settings. Those things all work together, and we'll talk about next week how the relationship between all three of those things comes together to make your good pictures great pictures. Thanks for watching. Of course, like down below and subscribe up above if you will. And down in the comments below, let me know what you think about this little short series and if it's helping you to become a better photographer. Thanks for watching.